How did the first empire in history collapse? Welcome to Collapse, where giants fall. Today, we trace time back to the dawn of civilization, where history turned into power and power into empire. Long before Rome, Persia, or Imperial China, a man imposed his will upon entire cities, Sargon of Akkad, the father of the very first known empire. From the fertile plains of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Anatolia, he forged a new unity, built on the ruins of rival kingdoms. How did a mere cupbearer become the king of kings? How did the very idea of an empire arise between the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates? Between swift conquests, founding myths, and an emerging bureaucracy, the Akkadian Empire opens a new era, one of limitless ambitions, centralized power, and eternal memory. But one day, it all collapses. The archives fall silent, the statues fall, and the city's empty. What happened? But before setting off on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a nice trip. From the silt-laden banks of the Tigris and Euphrates to the fertile plains of Lower Mesopotamia, the Sumerian world of the mid-3rd millennium. Before Christ is characterized by extraordinary innovations and a cultural effervescence that would influence future civilizations profoundly. At this time, the lands of Sumer house several powerful and often rival city-states, such as Uruk, Lagash, or Umma, all developing against the backdrop of advanced agricultural techniques, centralizing religious practices, and a complex political organization. In this part of history, it is essential to understand how Sumerian inventions and administration paved the way for the rise of Mesopotamia's most famous figure, Sargon of Akkad. Before narrating his epic, we must first keep in mind the foundational role of cuneiform writing, the importance of irrigation, the development of sophisticated accounting methods, and the strategic role of priest kings, called Ensi, in the life of the Sumerian cities. Among all the technical and cultural innovations of Mesopotamia, cuneiform writing remains one of the most remarkable. The term cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, which refers to the shape of the marks made on wet clay tablets using a stylus, a reed cut at an angle. Before the invention of a system of abstract signs, the Sumerians already used rudimentary pictograms to tally livestock, basic commodities, and commercial exchanges. As the pictograms developed and became more stylized, they evolved into true cuneiform characters capable of representing sounds, ideas, and complex notions. Over time, this tool allowed not only the recording of trading transactions, but also the writing of hymns, the recording of political treaties, and the establishment of rudimentary legal codes. Thanks to the spread of writing, knowledge and administration became more centralized, paving the way for more extensive forms of governance. Sumer is also the birthplace of large-scale irrigated agriculture. Even though the Fertile Crescent had already allowed many groups to practice cereal cultivation, the Sumerians perfected the techniques of canals, dikes, and reservoirs that carried water from the Tigris and Euphrates to distant fields. This mastery of hydraulics not only significantly increased agricultural yields, but also established a specialized hierarchy of managers, engineers, and workers. Powerful religious institutions were responsible for overseeing these works, as water was considered a divine gift that needed to be guided and controlled. Temples thus assumed a vital public responsibility, and priests ensured the harvests were plentiful. On one hand, this reinforced the spiritual authority of the great local deities, such as Inanna, Enlil, or Enki. On the other hand, it created a dependency of the agricultural population on central power, paving the way for more extensive political experimentation. Sumerian accounting, closely linked to writing, plays a crucial role in this structuring. From the moment harvests are recorded on clay tablets, the idea of inventory, premium, and tax becomes widespread. Scribes, often educated in temples, are responsible for recording the quantities of grain received, the distribution of rations, the lots of livestock, and all commercial transactions within the cities, as well as between the cities themselves. This accounting organization also serves to justify public expenses and maintain a certain balance in the distribution of resources. In fact, the more refined the accounting becomes, the more the institutions are hierarchized. At the same time, rivalries between cities continue to grow, each seeking to extend its control over lands, water, and trade routes. In Sumerian geopolitics, city-states are alternately allies or rivals, depending on economic, religious, and military circumstances. Alliances sometimes formalize within sacred leagues, where a common divine protector is invoked to sanctify peace treaties. For example, when Lagash and another city temporarily unite to counter Umma, they often do so by swearing an oath before the statue of Enlil, the chief god of Sumer, considered the master of winds and the atmosphere. But these agreements are often short-lived. Indeed, the desire for agricultural wealth, the lure of new trade routes, and the quest for prestige regularly push the kings of these cities, who are sometimes themselves priests of a tutelary god, to break treaties and attack. These small wars, although localized, weaken the entire region and create fertile ground for a more unifying, more ambitious leader to take over. The status of priest-king, called Ensi in Sumerian, illustrates the fusion between spiritual authority and political power in these cities. The Ensi, supposed to represent the local god on earth, oversees the proper conduct of rituals and supervises the worship of tutelary deities, but he is also the head of the army. Under his responsibility are scribes, hydraulic engineers, magistrates, and religious advisors. The Ensi interprets oracles, manages the distribution of grain from the reserves, and decides on military campaigns. In such a system, the legitimization of power necessarily involves a series of rites, favorable omens, and public declarations emphasizing the benevolence of a protective deity. It is thus at the heart of this world that Sargon, the founder of the Akkadian Empire, will rise and forever transform the architecture of power in Mesopotamia. The life of Sargon, the future legendary king, remains shrouded in a mystery carefully maintained by mythical accounts and tablets from after his reign. Modern historians estimate his rise to power around the mid-24th century before Christi, although it is difficult to establish precise dates. According to the famous legend of the basket on the Euphrates, Sargon's birth takes place under extraordinary circumstances. His mother, of unknown origin, would be either a priestess or a figure associated with the worship of a great deity and could not raise him. She then decides to place him, still an infant, in a tightly sealed wicker basket, which she abandons to the rushing waters of the Euphrates. The currents carry him until he is found by a humble water-bearer, tasked with maintaining the canals. This tale echoes other stories, such as that of the baby Moses mentioned later in biblical tradition, and already symbolizes a divine election, as Sargon is a child saved by providence, destined for an exceptional future. Raised by this water-bearer, Sargon grows up in modest conditions, but becomes immersed early in the essential activity of water management and hydraulic works. This familiarity with the daily life of popular classes gives him a concrete knowledge of grassroots realities, while offering him a unique opportunity to understand the subtleties of the canal network. Although the legend is impossible to verify, it reveals a dimension deeply rooted in the Sumerian mindset. A legitimate king, endowed with divine support, can emerge from a humble origin and rise through the ranks thanks to his strength, wisdom, and political skill. Some texts report that from a young age, he already demonstrated talents as an administrator and negotiator, which led him to be noticed by dignitaries at the court of Kish, one of the most influential cities of Sumer at the time. When Sargon reached adulthood, Kish was ruled by Ur-Zababa, a king whose ancient chronicles offer contradictory portraits. He is sometimes described as a monarch feared by his enemies, and at other times mocked for his lack of foresight or excessive superstition. What is certain is that Kish was one of the major centers of Lower Mesopotamia and had a respectable army, skilled in the use of the onager chariot and heavily armed infantry. According to some versions of the Sumerian tradition, Ur-Zababa, impressed by Sargon's skills, appointed him as cupbearer, a high-ranking position at the Kish court. The cupbearer was both master of the royal beverages and a confidant of the sovereign, often associated with political conspiracies. Accompanying Ur-Zababa on diplomatic visits or religious ceremonies, Sargon formed valuable contacts and closely observed the mechanics of power in a leading Sumerian city. Although few texts describe precisely the transition between the status of cupbearer and the usurpation of the throne, tradition holds that Sargon took advantage of a crisis or conspiracy to oust Ur-Zababa. Various accounts mention a prophetic dream where Ur-Zababa, panicked by the idea that his favorite cupbearer might overthrow him, unsuccessfully attempted to kill him. Other sources recount that sudden floods or bad omens had weakened the king's authority, offering Sargon the opportunity to rally military factions and elites irritated by the sovereign's incompetence. In this context, Sargon, supported by influential backers within the royal guard, either forced Ur-Zababa to abdicate or drove him out of Kish permanently. From that moment on, he was no longer a mere court official, as he became the architect of a much more ambitious political project, aimed at unifying the entire region and breaking the age-old domination of rival city-states. Sargon's legitimacy rests on several pillars. First, he takes advantage of the Sumerian tradition that a great conqueror holds a celestial mandate. Many late tablets report that he forged a spiritual alliance with Enlil, the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon. By assuring that his conquest had divine blessing, he appeased the religious objections of certain temples and convinced priests not to resist his unifying will. According to rituals, once in possession of the throne, Sargon is said to have offered lavish sacrifices in the temples of Enlil and Inanna to demonstrate his piety and seal his new title. The underlying idea is to prove that the new sovereign, even of uncertain origin, acts not against the gods, but to exalt their grandeur across all the Sumerian city-states. Next, Sargon succeeded in rallying to his cause a disciplined and innovative army. The periods of constant conflict in Lower Mesopotamia required a permanent military force to deter internal revolts and combat external enemies. During his early campaigns around Ur-Zababa, Sargon could observe the vulnerability of the Sumerian cities, often fragments of an overly heterogeneous whole. He realized also that mercenaries or contingents from neighboring peoples like the Elamites, tribes from the Zagros or the north, could be incorporated into a larger, more flexible army. It is likely that he began training and reorganizing his troops in a style that would later become typical of the Akkadian Empire. This included units specialized in siege warfare, archers equipped with more powerful composite bows than the simple Sumerian ones, and officers loyalized by land grants. According to art historical accounts, that is, traditions blending fact and legend, Sargon's seizure of power in Kish corresponds almost simultaneously with the emergence of an imperial vision. His desire is not to be content with just one city, however prestigious it may be, but to subjugate the surrounding cities so they all acknowledge his sovereignty and divine legitimacy. This aspiration to dominate all of Sumer, perhaps beyond, will become the main driver of Sargon's career, even though he soon encounters strong opposition from neighboring kings. The tablets notably mention the presence of a particularly powerful Sumerian ruler, Lugal Zagisi of Uruk, who will play a major role in Sargon's first great military confrontation. However, before moving on to conquest, Sargon must also reassure the religious elites of Kish and present himself as a conceptual heir to the region's political tradition. A fundamental element for the dynasty that Sargon is about to establish is the ideological construction around his name. Sources tell us that Sargon could come from the Akkadian name Sharu Ukun, meaning the king is legitimate or the king is true. This name alone serves as propaganda to affirm his validity to the throne. Beyond the symbolism, it also supports the gradual transition from Sumerian to Akkadian as the main language of administration, while marking the emergence of a new elite. Kish, located on the edges of the Sumerian and Semitic worlds, is indeed a point of contact between different ethnicities and languages. The fact that Sargon may be of Semitic origin, rather than strictly Sumerian, can explain why he becomes a rallying point for a composite population seeking to distinguish itself from the exclusive influence of the former priest kings of Sumer, who mainly spoke and wrote in Sumerian. Throughout literary traditions, Sargon's personal story is imbued with a certain pathos. He is often described as a character endowed with incredible willpower, overflowing with ambition, but also aware of the need to be accepted by the religious and merchant classes. Later praise tablets indicate that he would distribute food to the poor, pacify areas where peasants suffered from the abuses of corrupt lords, and limit excessive levies in the fields. Whether these are exaggerations or real examples of his policy, these actions demonstrate a well-calculated form of populism intended to diffuse internal conflicts. In this respect, he articulates a clear discourse. Under his leadership, the country will be unified, everyone's rights guaranteed, and piety towards the gods will remain fundamental. Thus, he presents himself as a mediator king, capable of ending the chronic rivalries between Sumerian cities and establishing an order hitherto unimaginable. To consolidate his nascent authority, Sargon also benefits from Kish's military reputation. The battles fought to reinforce the city's borders have built a network of alliances and dependencies. Senior officers, rewarded with largesse, fervently support the new strongman, while the population envisions the opportunity to prosper through future war spoils. It is even likely that Sargon created for the first time in the region's history an almost professional army, mobilized continuously and financed by the central administration. This concept of a permanent military force, supported by a bureaucracy capable of raising taxes and redistributing resources, constitutes a major historical precedent. In fact, the success of his initial campaigns against Kish's immediate enemies earns him the title of Great King and instills fear in the hearts of his adversaries, who quickly understand that an era of great upheavals is dawning in Mesopotamia. Faced with this ascent, one of Sargon's key diplomatic strategies is to never sever the link between secular power and spiritual power. Even if he ousts Ur-Zababa and seizes Kish, he does not eliminate the local clergy nor renounce religious traditions, but integrates them into his broader political project. The city's scribes continue to perform their duties, and the priests in charge of the cult of Enlil or other deities retain their privileges, provided they pledge allegiance to the new sovereign. Thus, when he decides to take the royal title and claim hegemony over the entire region, he is already supported by a good part of the Sumerian intelligentsia. who see in him either a promise of stability or an opportunity to increase their own influence. Many cities, weary of endless wars, may see in Sargon a master strong enough to restore peace and prosperity. However, it should be remembered that, even though Sargon's aura is spreading rapidly, he still has many resistances to overcome. The Sumerian cities have their own identities and jealous tutelary gods, proud of their sovereignty. Uruk, in particular, has not said its last word, and its leader, Lugal Zagisi, also presents himself as the divine instrument destined to unify Sumer. Indeed, Lugal Zagisi boasts of having received power directly from Enlil, and multiplies ceremonies to prove his legitimacy beyond the cities. Other cities, like Umma, Lagash, or Ur, observe the situation with caution, ready to rally to the victor if it ensures their relative autonomy and the protection of their trading activities. In this context, Sargon's reputation as a feared conqueror is gradually spreading, while his army inaugurates new encirclement strategies, supported by engineers specialized in the construction of temporary bridges over the canals. An often underestimated aspect in Sargon's epic biography is his formidable skill in propaganda. The Mesopotamians are particularly sensitive to the question of divine will. If a city goes to war, it is either to punish a sacrilege or to fulfill a higher will, with sacred texts needing to be read or interpreted by priests to legitimize each action. Sargon understood this perfectly and mastered this rhetoric in his official proclamations. He uses set phrases that claim Enlil has decreed kingship over the lands to Sargon, or that Inanna has granted victorious strength to her champion. Thus, when he speaks before assemblies of notables, he presents himself as the zealous servant of the gods. Moreover, he openly supports the high dignitaries of the main sanctuaries, promising them the reconstruction of temples damaged in previous conflicts and granting them donations according to Sumerian customs. This art of communication serves him not only in lower Mesopotamia, but also in the more northern, more Semitic cities, which begin to feel attracted to this new expanding power. By adopting certain military, linguistic, and religious values familiar to the Semitic populations, Sargon weaves solid alliances that will quickly consolidate his territorial base. Some researchers even think he sought to get closer to groups of pastoral nomads settled in nearby steppes, to benefit from their expertise in livestock and mobility. Such a multi-ethnic coalition is unprecedented in Mesopotamian history, as previously, the Sumerian cities generally limited themselves to the small-sized community tied to the local god. With Sargon, the notion of kingdom or domination takes on an unusual scale, foreshadowing the concept of a multi-ethnic empire as it would be conceived later. Beyond mere military ambition, Sargon's personality is thus reflected in his concrete actions as a governor. Whether it involves appointing loyal governors at the head of conquered cities, reforming fiscal practices to increase grain reserves and finance administration, or promoting the use of Akkadian in official deeds, he is already orchestrating the foundations of a centralized political structure. Although it will be necessary to wait for the creation of Akkad or Agad, according to transcription, for his project to take its full scope, the foundations are clearly laid during his stay at Kish and the initial years that follow. This initial phase allows him to put into practice a know-how accumulated in the shadow of the Sumerian administration and gradually establish the legitimacy of the dynasty he dreams of founding. Sargon, far from being merely a warlord, aims to symbolize the renewal of a land exhausted by endless internal wars. In speeches broadcast to the populations, he emphasizes that he will pacify the region, ensure everyone's prosperity, and erect temples to honor the gods, whether Sumerian or Semitic. Furthermore, he will adopt and perfect essential elements of Sumerian civilization such as accounting, irrigation methods, and the organization of scribes. It is, in a way, a tacit pact that is being formed, as Sargon does not claim to annihilate Sumerian culture, but to exalt it within a new political framework. In his plan, all cities will be integrated into a common administration, equipped with worship centers and renewed infrastructure. This promise of renewal is a dream for a growing portion of the population, while arousing distrust, even hatred, among those who fear the loss of their ancestral sovereignty. While the literary tradition has sometimes idealized Sargon, it is important to remember that he operates in a brutal world where force often prevails over right. The conquest, necessary for his unification project, involves taxing sieges, raids ravaging enemy fields, and reprisals against cities that refuse to submit. To win the loyalty of the troops, he sometimes allows pillaging. Official texts, of course, do not dwell on the atrocities, preferring to emphasize the ruler's clemency towards those who surrender and the sacred nature of his military interventions. However, it is evident that for the time, Sargon's rise is closely linked to a methodical use of violence, without which he could not have imposed his authority. Yet, what truly distinguishes Sargon from other Sumerian kings of his time is the other facet of his actions. It is the administrative organization and the establishment of a coherent imperial ideology. Previous Sumerian kings, even when they won wars, tended to be content with briefly vassalizing the enemy and then withdrawing. Sargon, however, aims to physically and enduringly maintain a political presence in conquered territories, to install governors or representatives who will report to the great king and transfer resources to him. Thus, each conquered city, be it Sumerian, Elamite, or from a Semitic community, is integrated into a larger hierarchical entity under the aegis of an increasingly sprawling royal bureaucracy. All this is glimpsed from his initial period, before he fully proclaims himself the king of Akkad and launches major campaigns beyond the traditional borders of Sumer. The last key to understanding Sargon's rapid rise lies in the alliance he forges with Enlil, a deity considered the father of all gods in the Sumerian pantheon. According to inscriptions found later, Sargon presents himself as the chosen one of Enlil, the one who fulfills his will on earth. Since the Sumerians, very attached to the concept of destiny, decreed by the assembly of gods, believe that Enlil is both the distributor of goods and the dispenser of climatic disasters. Having him on one's side is a symbol of considerable significance. The priests of Enlil, based mainly in Nippur, a sacred city, occupy an exceptional place in Sumerian religious life. Archaeologists and historians consider that it is probably by mastering Nippur, or at least by sealing an alliance with its religious elites, that Sargon reaches a decisive point in legitimizing his new power. Thus, any king who desires to impose himself as the ruler of Sumer must imperatively ensure the benevolence of Enlil, this god representing the sacred citizenship of all of southern Mesopotamia. When Sargon finally proclaims himself the Great King or uncontested Lord of Kish, he is no longer just a local leader with an army. He is the bearer of a boundless ambition, one that is thought out and supported by a network of political connections, military advantages, and more than anything, a religious aura. This unprecedented combination makes it easier for him to launch direct offensives against Lugal, Zagisi, and other rivals. Of course, the pursuit of his conquests won't happen without setbacks, and the part of history recounting his grand campaigns is still crucial to uncover. But before diving into these expansions, understanding the Sumerian soil is essential. Without the major innovations of cuneiform writing, large-scale irrigation, harvest accounting, or the centralization of religious and political power, Sargon could never have imposed his will and founded what is often considered the first empire in the historical sense of the term. As the armies of Sargon of Akkad prepare to turn a decisive page in Mesopotamian history, a figure stands on the political stage of Sumer. It is none other than Lugal Zagisi. At the end of the 3rd millennium before Christ, this ambitious leader already reigns over several cities in the alluvial plain, which he has temporarily succeeded in unifying. Lugal Zagisi, often associated with the city of located along the Tigris and Euphrates in what is now southern Iraq, has pursued an aggressive expansion policy to consolidate his power. He now controls territories stretching from floodplains to Uruk, a sacred city renowned for its religious monuments and literary traditions. His declared goal remains the preservation of Sumerian hegemony under his unique banner, hoping to rule over the entire region without sharing. Yet, this global ambition will soon encounter an unexpected adversary. It is, of course, Sargon, the conqueror from Kish, whose unification strategy will exceed anything Sumer had experienced up to that point. Power dynamics harden, alliances are reorganized, and the fate of Sumerian cities gradually shifts towards a new imperial era. In this pivotal period, the southern part of Mesopotamia, known as Sumer, is a patchwork of highly autonomous city-states, often in rivalry for control over water resources and agricultural land. Their economy depends on irrigation and canal management, and each city competes for the best arable land, causing perpetual tensions. Lugal Zagisi, initially famous for subduing Lagash, which he accused of encroaching on Uma's lands, thereby gains a solid reputation as an effective military leader. His victory over Lagash brings a fertile region and flourishing craftsmanship under his authority. However, new threats arise as Sargon, whose power is growing in Kish and the surrounding areas, turns his attention southward. Sargon perceives the potential for a forced alliance or direct domination over these city-states with prestigious pasts, determined to integrate them into a larger entity. Diplomatic maneuvers multiply, including alliances, religious interest deals, and promises of amnesty for certain notables. Despite these attempts, it is inevitably on the battlefield that the supremacy between Lugal Zagisi and Sargon will be decided. When the two protagonists come to arms, the clash focuses around Uruk. The importance of this city is crucial as it stands at the heart of the country of Sumer, symbolizes the oldest traditions of the cult of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, and controls a vast network of canals. Lugal Zagisi himself had proclaimed Uruk as one of the bases of his power, fortifying the city and deploying loyal garrisons there. He knew perfectly well that losing Uruk would mean a psychological and symbolic collapse of his authority. Taking advantage of a network of informants and a reorganized military apparatus, Sargon, therefore, launches a lightning campaign. Rather than dispersing his forces in various sieges, he targets the nerve centers of the adversary. His army, trained by preliminary campaigns in the region of Kish, has become adept at the speed of movement. The Sumerian chariots of the time, drawn by donkeys or onagers, are not yet the fast war chariots that will be known centuries later, but they provide logistical support, transporting supplies and equipment. Added to this are infantry troops ready to maneuver effectively in canals and muddy terrains. The decisive moment comes when an attempt by Lugal Zagisi to cut off Sargon's supply routes fails. The troops from lacking coordination, become bogged down around Digir, a small fortified locality near Uruk. Sargon takes advantage of this to bypass the enemy and strike directly at the heart of the city. The walls of Uruk, impressive in their height, are certainly a challenge. However, Sargon mobilizes engineers whom he has begun to surround himself with, particularly to build structures that facilitate crossing moats or installing rudimentary siege towers. The art of siege warfare is still in its infancy, but the idea of setting up embankments or temporary bridges is already taking hold. Before Lugal Zagisi even realizes he has left a breach, Sargon manages to find a less defended access point that allows him to enter Uruk. After some violent urban skirmishes, the city is forced to surrender. The gates of the city open, and Sargon's triumph is complete. He subjugates Uruk and has himself recognized as the sole legitimate authority over the heart of Sumer. The surrender of Uruk has gigantic repercussions throughout the Mesopotamian plain. Neighboring cities like or Eridu instantly understand that Lugal Zagisi's power is teetering. A domino effect occurs as numerous temples and notables recognize Sargon's military superiority and choose not to continue the fight alongside Lugal Zagisi, preferring to negotiate to preserve their privileges. According to tradition, the priests of Uruk openly declared that the goddess Inanna, the city's patroness, withdrew her favor from Lugal Zagisi to bestow it upon Sargon. Although these accounts are heavily tinged with later propaganda, they reflect a religious shift that overlaps with the military conquest. Thus, the capture of Uruk embodies the first step toward the unification of Sumer under a centralized authority. This is the very essence of the Akkadian project. It is about establishing a strong authority that transcends city boundaries, while sufficiently respecting local cults to draw divine legitimacy from them. After this decisive victory, the unenviable fate of Lugal Zagisi truly seals Sargon's grip. Mesopotamian chronicles report that Lugal Zagisi was captured and paraded in chains to the city of Nippur, a sacred site dedicated to the great god Enlil. The practice of exhibiting the defeated leader illustrates the intent to politically and religiously humiliate the adversary. Nippur played a major spiritual role, as all kings sought Enlil's endorsement to justify their sovereignty. Capturing Lugal Zagisi in this holy place, then presenting him as a prisoner unable to resist the new leader, sends a clear message. Enlil has turned away from the former protector of Sumer and now blesses Sargon's rise as king of Kish, who became the uncontested leader of the southern plain. This ritual politically seals the unification of Lower Mesopotamia, a nearly unprecedented phenomenon until then. Freed from the obstacle that was Lugal Zagisi, Sargon immediately turns his gaze outward. Mesopotamia, framed by the Tigris and Euphrates, is part of a network of trade routes that connect it to the east, west, and north. To the east lies Elam, a territory roughly corresponding to the present-day Khuzestan in southwestern Iran. This area, rich in mineral deposits, has long-standing trade links with Sumer, particularly through the route of Susa, the gateway to Elam. To the northwest, the Syrian-Mesopotamian corridor leads to the Orontes Valley, located in present-day Syria, and also crosses Lebanon to the Mediterranean. Finally, further towards Anatolia, the present-day Turkey, there are sources of precious metals, such as silver and lead, which already attract interest. Sargon desires to exert influence over these routes in order to benefit from the flow of goods and extend his authority beyond the Sumerian cities. Campaigns against Elam were the first to be considered right after the definitive victory over Lugal Zagisi. Securing the eastern border would ensure the peace of the subjugated provinces and provide easier access to the resources necessary for maintaining an increasingly professional army. The Akkadian troops, now renowned for their discipline, took advantage of the momentum provided by Sargon to cross the marshy zone separating the Sumerian plain from the Iranian foothills. Unlike many earlier Sumerian conflicts, where city-states waged war for a few fields, this expedition had the character of a distant conquest. Driven by the new sovereign, Akkadian scribes carefully documented these campaigns. The cuneiform tablets, commemorative cylinder seals, and votive inscriptions celebrated the domination over Elam. The logistical aspect also took on greater importance. It was no longer enough to line up a few cohorts of infantry. One had to ensure the availability of supplies, pack animals, efficient weapons, and men trained for long-distance marches. The Akkadian accounts speak of cities like Susa or Awan, located on the Elamite foothills, which Sargon claimed to have subdued. He imposed his tutelage by negotiating the installation of local governors loyal to him, sometimes from the Elamite elites themselves, to limit the risk of uprisings. This method, foreshadowing a more structured mode of imperial administration, involved allowing a degree of autonomy while collecting taxes and controlling the transit routes. The Zagros Mountains, separating lower Mesopotamia from Elam, remained not entirely pacified, with many local tribes persisting, sometimes engaging in brigandage to the detriment of caravans. However, the annals suggest that Sargon established fortified garrisons along the passes, thus ensuring a minimum of stability for commerce. Once the eastern zone was secured, the conquering momentum turned westward, following the course of the Euphrates through territories corresponding to present-day Syria. The declared objective was twofold. It was about controlling the fluvial axis, essential for transporting wheat, barley, dates, and cattle to Akkad, the capital that Sargon was to found, the exact location of which is unknown, and projecting his power toward the Mediterranean Sea. The river was dotted with way station cities such as Mari or Tutul, identifiable today thanks to archaeology. The sources from the time, although fragmentary, suggest that Sargon's army reached the Orontes region, a river flowing through Syria and Lebanon, to conduct military operations. Some local cities, presumably fascinated by the Akkadian force, negotiated their peaceful surrender in exchange for the waiving of ransoms, freedom of commerce, or the confirmation of their elites in power. This expansion westward, though less documented than the Elamite campaigns, was of strategic importance because the Orontes, being a secondary route to the Mediterranean coast, offered the opportunity to acquire cedarwood and various exotic products renowned in Mesopotamia. Ancient archives also relate Sargon's intent to push to the fringes of Anatolia to establish trade relations for tin and metals. Tin, crucial in the making of bronze, was transported from eastern regions such as the Iranian foothills and upper Mesopotamia, but it could also come from Anatolia. The quest for metals thus drove a dynamic of expeditions northward, which Sargon and his successors were to pursue. The caravan routes of Anatolia crossed mountain passes and required solid contacts with the local populations, often settled in fortified sites. Mentions are found on some tablets of the land of Subartu, which includes northern Mesopotamia and southeastern Anatolia, where Akkadian armies reportedly conducted missions of pillage or submission to consolidate their supremacy. At the extreme southeast of the Fertile Crescent lies the Arabo-Persian Gulf, known today as the Persian Gulf, which opens onto sea routes leading to the current territories of Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. The Akkadian campaigns also sought to establish control there. Sumerian tradition sometimes mentions ships transporting luxury goods like precious woods, semi-precious stones, such as lapis lazuli or carnelian, and metals transiting from more distant lands. Sargon likely wanted to regulate these flows to increase the prosperity of his new political entity. Tablets mention that several ports may have hosted Akkadian contingents, tasked with collecting taxes or preventing potential foreign incursions. Some historians see in this the early beginnings of a true Mesopotamian thalassocracy, although Sargon's control over maritime navigation remained very partial, as the ships were modest and dependent on coastal navigation. On the military level, one of the major innovations facilitating these unprecedented conquests concerns the use of the composite bow. This bow is made from layers of different materials, mainly wood, horn, and tendon, compressed and then assembled to provide a more powerful weapon, capable of delivering arrows over a longer range than the simple wooden bow. In vast plains like those of Mesopotamia, where engagements often take place in open terrain, the superiority conferred by a force equipped with composite bows proves decisive. The Akkadian troops were not the sole inventors of this technology, but Sargon encouraged its use on a larger scale, increasing the number of archers and facilitating their training. The archers, capable of harassing the enemy even before close contact, combined with heavy infantry armed with bronze weapons, provided the Akkadian army with a tactical advantage, allowing them to defeat less prepared adversaries. Similarly, the first engineering corps, whose reference appears only subtly in texts, would become one of the hallmarks of the Akkadian conquest. Sargon understood that to conduct large-scale campaigns, it was no longer enough to chase the enemy. Rivers and streams had to be crossed quickly and in a coordinated manner. The famous floating bridges, imagined to be made up of boats or rafts assembled in series, allowed for the crossing of light artillery, livestock, and entire troops without losing precious time, bypassing natural obstacles. Cuneiform sources sometimes describe the establishment of temporary footbridges to cross the Euphrates or the Tigris, and then, once the maneuver was completed, their rapid dismantling to prevent the enemy from following. This unprecedented mobility likely played a crucial role in the tactical surprise Sargon imposed on the Sumerian cities and their potential allies. The sudden eruption of an army coming from the other side destabilized the defensive plans of adversaries more anchored in positional warfare. Beyond technical prowess, the effectiveness of these conquests lies in the speed of deployments. Archives suggest that during the early years of Sargon's reign, strategic initiative remained the main asset. Instead of holding long sieges, Sargon preferred speed, surprise, and the tactic of a flashy strike. The Sumerian cities had already experienced conflicts, but rarely so sustained and on such a vast scale. The conquest of Uruk not only marked the elimination of Lugal Zagisi, but also generated a psychological momentum for the Akkadian troops. They now felt capable of defeating anyone who stood against them, whether rebellious cities or neighboring kingdoms. It should also be noted that as Sargon pushed his borders, he extended increasingly long supply lines. Hence the importance of water management, grain warehouses, and the establishment of a rudimentary administration to oversee harvests and ensure the availability of food for the soldiers. A relay system was set up along major routes, allowing the dispatch of messages and the priority delivery of goods intended for the war. In many conquered regions, resistance still organizes itself. A few vassal states of the former coalition of Lugal Zagisi attempt to form a united front. They still believe that Sargon's power is only temporary, or that he will focus on a well-defined territory. They count on the fact that the effort required to control so many provinces beyond the Sumerian heartland will be unsustainable, or that regional revolts will eventually break out in multiple places simultaneously. However, Sargon and his officers are precisely working to suppress these inclinations by carrying out localized reprisals, and, above all, by maintaining a constant flow of information. The first building blocks of an intelligence service are being established, with messengers traveling the roads, reporting rumors, and suspected movements to the capital. These measures, although less known to the general public, prove vital for the ongoing expansion of the Akkadian Empire. The triumph over Lugal Zagisi and the integration of most of Sumer thus paved the way for a series of offensives beyond the Sumerian cradle. This progression demonstrates a rise in power of Akkad, which seeks to assert itself as the core of a political system that goes beyond the mere local framework. Later sources, magnifying the figure of Sargon, may exaggerate the exact extent of his empire, claiming it reached the Upper Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Lower Sea, which is the Persian Gulf. Whatever the case, the impact on the entire Middle East is considerable. For a contemporary international audience, it must be emphasized that this expansion was unlike later empires, which were more centralized and equipped with superior means of communication. Nevertheless, for the end of the 3rd millennium before Christ, it is an unprecedented achievement, allowing Sargon to establish the political and symbolic recognition of the Akkadian dynasty. One might wonder how Sargon and his lieutenants managed to persuade such diverse territories to align themselves under the Akkadian aegis. Besides the logistical difficulty and the use of force, religious propaganda and the integration of local elites into the new power structure play a crucial role. If a temple agreed to celebrate Sargon's new legitimacy as the favorite of the gods, the sovereign, in return, committed to endowing it or confirming its properties. This mutual relationship tempered the inclinations for uprising. Of course, financial tribute or payment in kind, such as grain, livestock, or precious wood, was required, but cultural autonomy was not systematically undermined. Thus, in the early years of this military unification, the Akkadian coalition appears more as a confederate system reinforced by arms than a completely unified administration as seen in the 21st century before Christ E, under Ur III. Yet, Sargon, as a pragmatic man often described as skillful, knows he cannot manage every conquered parcel solely through coercion. He lays the foundations of an imperial logic, notably the recognition of a central power demanding taxes, soldiers, resources, and loyalty in exchange for protection against raiders and rival states. This historical turning point marks the emergence of a new type of authority. For centuries, Sumerian cities had experienced hegemonies that lasted only briefly, each city in turn imposing its ascendancy. Nevertheless, no one had yet managed to create a structure solid enough to last and to exert extended control beyond the borders of Sumer. By capturing Uruk and triumphing over Lugal Zagisi, Sargon lays the groundwork for a broader regional ambition. The subsequent conquests, whether they lead to Elam, the Orontes, Anatolia, or along the Persian Gulf, illustrate the desire to anchor the Akkadian military and administrative apparatus durably in a strategically unified space. The use of superior military technologies like the composite bow and logistical innovations like floating bridges ensures a crucial advantage over less structured adversaries. Ancient chroniclers preserve the memory of his military revolution by depicting Sargon with a quasi-mythical aura. He would be the man who, starting from modest conditions, supplanted all the kings of Sumer and conquered lands where his name resonated like a divine title. This image, undoubtedly embellished by posterity, nevertheless reflects the magnitude of the upheavals of the time. One can also discern the gradual emergence of a permanent army, continuously fed and trained, instead of relying solely on militias mobilized for short seasonal campaigns. The transfer of soldiers between the established garrisons and conquered territories and the center of the empire allows for a certain rotation, providing recruits with the opportunity to gain experience on different fronts. War, which was often confined to isolated conflicts between nearby cities, now extends over large areas, prompting a new relationship to violence and power. Sargon's victories do not rely solely on luck or divine favor. They also rest on meticulous logistics, combined with an initiative rarely seen in earlier Mesopotamia. This dynamic of rapid conquests naturally stirs curiosity and sometimes hostility from distant powers, anxious over a single entity dominating the lower plain and its trade routes. Some sporadic alliances form between local kings to hinder the Akkadian march. However, Sargon's response, firm and punitive, often ends up making adversaries more inclined to submit. The Akkadian accounts of these campaigns generally emphasize the unrivaled glory of the sovereign, who, through successive victories, becomes the guarantor of stability. Nevertheless, this extended unification may actually be a more gradual process, where agreements, truces, and buffer zones remain frequent. To a current international audience, the idea of a first empire at this time evokes both fascination and questions. It is true that in Egypt, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom were already building imposing pyramids, that there were large planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, or that in China, the Longshan culture hinted at the emergence of powerful political entities. But these societies, despite their sophistication, do not appear to have established a system of conquests to unify multiple distinct cities over a wide area, with a centralized army and governors dependent on a single political center. This is precisely what makes the nascent Akkadian Empire unique through its foundational conquests, that is, to conquer, annex, and manage diverse populations under a single power, supported by technical innovations and an expanded communication network. This tremendous expansionist push, triggered by the fall of Lugal Zagisi, would not have been possible without an already fertile ground in administrative and military inventions. Sumer, for centuries, had experimented with cuneiform writing, accounting, and hydraulic management. The Sumerian military framework was not at its beginnings, as it consisted of primitive chariots, bronze weapons, tightly packed formations. However, Sargon adopts and perfects these tools, adding new planning methods to them. Thus, strategic success is born from the coherent assembly of material and human resources, complemented by a vision of what an empire should be, a coherent whole, directed by a single will, capable of levying taxes and contingents to further strengthen its grip. The accounts often mention the grand parade the Akkadian army would have held after the capture of Uruk, displaying conquered trophies and captured prisoners. In Mesopotamian ideology, the ruling class constantly sought to affirm its privileged link with the gods, as military victories symbolized divine protection. The steles and bas-reliefs, of which some fragments have been found, show lines of captives and ranks of disciplined soldiers, framed by religious symbols like the Star of Ishtar, equivalent to Inanna, or the horned tiara reserved for deities. This iconography had a powerful impact on subdued populations, who understood that Akkadian power was now sanctioned by the celestial realm, and that it was better to adhere to it than to fight it. In Mesopotamian history, such demonstrations of strength had existed before, but never with such a degree of organization and scale. The geopolitical horizon of the region is transformed. Sumer is no longer an aggregate of rival cities. It is integrated into a larger hierarchical ensemble led by an elite nourished by extraordinary ambitions. Throughout these conquests, a new complication arises. Sargon must consolidate his gains before his authority dissipates in the multiple distant provinces. The battles in Elam and on the Orontes strengthen his reputation, but also test the robustness of his command structures. The floating bridges, the standardization of weapons, and the establishment of rudimentary siege engines do not yet guarantee unwavering control. Certainly, Sargon's prestige and the demonstration of his might inspire resignation or collaboration among many. However, it remains necessary to closely monitor strategic routes, such as Susa or Mari, to prevent any secession. This constant vigilance mobilizes entire garrisons and delegated officers, sometimes members of Sargon's family or his close supporters. Many specialists believe that it is during these times that the first embryos of a service nobility are formed, placed in key positions to maintain the connection with the capital. Numerous steles inform about the fact that a Lugal, the Sumerian term for a local king, was often merely a shadow of himself, frequently forced to recognize Akkadian suzerainty and adopt imposed customs. As the Akkadian military machine continues its march forward, one cannot ignore the symbolic message conveyed by this expansion. Behind each victory against a city or a kingdom, Sargon sends a clear signal to all Mesopotamia. None can defy the new order with impunity anymore. Gradually, his foundational conquests acquire a legendary aura, and his ability to subdue the known world and return laden with resplendent treasures is praised. Hymns and official inscriptions, some of which will be repeated by his descendants, engrave in the collective imagination the idea that Sargon has tamed the four corners of the horizon. The flourishing of this imperial dream relies on tales of resounding battles, forged alliances, and imposed oaths, portraying an unblemished unification. Indeed, the poetic exaggeration needs to be tempered, for the reality on the ground must have been more chaotic, with fortified enclaves sometimes seceding in poorly controlled areas. But to the eyes of the cities that until then had known only a cycle of incessant struggles, the rise of a dominant force holding a vast territory in check sounds like an unprecedented phenomenon, inaugurating a new political era. The foundational conquests are therefore not limited to mere military victories. They reveal the birth of a centralizing vision in which Akkad, the future capital, presents itself as a pivot of the world. The submission of Lugal Zagisi and the fall of Uruk seal the triumph of a single man over all the great temples and palaces of Sumer. In the wake, the incursion into Elam, the hold over the regions of the Orontes, the thrust towards Anatolia, and the domination of the Arabian-Persian Gulf draw a strategic control arc around vital trade routes. The adoption of the composite bow, emblematic of Akkadian military might, symbolizes the determination to reach a tactical milestone, while the organization of floating bridges and attack engineers heralds the will to overcome all geographical obstacles. In the end, Sargon outlines the contours of an authority that claims to be the first large-scale imperial structure with a political, religious, and military network, transcending the ancient city-state boundaries. This new path is not only carved out by Sargon's skill, but made possible by a conjuncture characterized by the weakening of certain traditional rivals, the unanimous interest in bronze roads, and the availability of technical know-how. The success of the division of engineers, as well as the increased reach of the composite bow, is a metaphor for a Mesopotamia now launched into an era of methodical conquest. At the gates of this entire complex, the submission of Uruk and the humiliating capture of Lugal Zagisi act as catalysts, demonstrating to any city still hesitant that it would be better to align with the victor. The Sumerian cities, previously attached to their independence, must admit that a more encompassing force is taking shape, one that is bearer of new rules assured by arms and exposed by religious rhetoric. In this way, in a few years, the political map of the lowland is completely redrawn. The foundational conquests of Sargon, marked by suddenness and efficiency, establish a model that will deeply inspire subsequent imperial structures in the Near East and elsewhere. The idea of establishing a new capital addressed crucial administrative needs for Sargon's rule. Until then, each Sumerian city-state had its own decision-making centers, often linked to a main temple and a local ruler known as Ensi or Patisi. By occupying the supreme function over a now unified territory, Sargon wanted a central point from which to disseminate his orders and exert more direct control over the conquered lands. Akkad was thus conceived as a unique hub, capable of managing the constant influx of resources and tributes from the various subjugated regions. This vision illustrated a major structural change in political organization, transitioning from rival cities to a cohesive whole, coordinated by an administrative center. Furthermore, Akkad's supposed position on strategic river routes made the rapid transport of goods possible, whether it be grains, metals, or textiles. Archives also mention land caravans that linked the capital to the empire's borders. In this way, Sargon's authority could be exercised efficiently, supported by an unprecedented infrastructure and by the centralization of decision-making. When analyzing tablets that describe this organization, one already notes the existence of a clear administrative hierarchy, a bureaucratic apparatus conscious of its mission, to maintain the cohesion of an empire with shifting borders. Through this means, Akkad emerged as a pivotal hub. At the heart of this imperial structure, a network of governors called Shakanaku played a decisive role. These administrators, appointed by the Akkadian sovereign, ensured the maintenance of order in the provinces, regularly collecting taxes in various forms. This could involve deliveries of grain, livestock, textiles, or even silver ingots, a precious commodity in Mesopotamia. Local populations were thus subject to centralized taxation, sometimes demanding, but essential for financing the permanent army and major public works. In return, the imperial power had to guarantee the security of trade routes and political stability, offering a certain form of protection against external invasions or internal raids. The Shakanaku occupied a privileged position between the decision-making center of Akkad and the vassal cities, transmitting directives and decrees, ensuring that new imperial laws were applied locally. Their ability to exercise delegated authority was both a means of quickly disseminating the monarch's will and avoiding perpetual fiscal revolts. Historians often consider this system of provincial governors as one of the great innovations of the Akkadian Empire because it ensured a homogeneous and coherent administration on a large scale. Even though, from time to time, some governors attempted to claim additional privileges, the overall apparatus seemed robust enough to endure for several generations of rulers. Thus, imperial authority gradually consolidated. One of the pillars of this Akkadian administration was the creation of an official calendar, standardized across the entire kingdom. Previously, each Sumerian city sometimes had its own cyclical or lunar cycle based on local astronomical phenomena. With the empire, the necessity of synchronizing harvests, tax collection, and religious ceremonies became crucial. The central power therefore harmonized the way of counting months and years. Simultaneously, there was also a standardization of weights and measures to facilitate trade and establish fairness in taxation. The Akkadian names given to the measurement units spread to the farthest reaches of the kingdom. This increased standardization limited fraud and ensured a certain transparency in commerce, whether it was the sale of barley, bartering of livestock, or exchanges of precious metals. Thus, the palaces of Akkad could better control the influx of resources and ensure that the accumulated wealth benefited the entire imperial system. This rationalization effort illustrated well the bureaucratic spirit that animated Sargon's empire. Thanks to these reforms, Mesopotamia was moving towards an unprecedented degree of centralization, where the management of time and space was now under a unique political framework. The calendar and measurement systems therefore became the tangible instruments of Akkadian power. This normalization greatly contributed to the material and ideological unity of the nascent empire. Besides time management, the Akkadian Empire established an internal communication network that almost prefigured a postal service ahead of its time. Cuneiform tablets served not only to record transactions, but also to quickly transmit strategic or administrative information. The first organized relays allowed royal emissaries to travel from city to city, ensuring a smooth circulation of imperial orders. These official tablets were often sealed with a specific cylinder seal, ensuring their authenticity and preventing forgery. Scribes, trained in the capital schools, were capable of writing and deciphering these coded messages according to a system of ideograms and phonetic signs. In this way, a governor could inform Akkad of a food shortage or an imminent military threat in a few days, rather than weeks. The relay tablets also gave rise to the first multilingual decrees, as the sovereign wanted to be understood by non-Sumerian Akkadian populations, especially in frontier areas. This practice consisted of translating official texts into several local languages to ensure no misunderstandings compromised imperial authority. Traces of such an approach are found in the documents unearthed at Ebla or Mari, where Akkadian sometimes cohabits with Hurrian dialects. Through this means, the empire consolidated the idea of a communicating, extensive, and responsive central power. This unprecedented fluidity of information reinforced the government's efficiency while fostering a sense of collective belonging. Within this vast imperial organization, the figure of the queen or high priestess Enheduanna holds a unique place. Presumed daughter of Sargon himself, she is often considered the first author in history whose name has come down to us. Her writings, notably hymns dedicated to the goddess Inanna, are written in Sumerian and show an exceptional mastery of the literary language. She is also credited with composing complex theological texts that exalted divine power and, indirectly, that of the Akkadian sovereign. Enheduanna played a crucial role in religious propaganda. As the high priestess of the god Nana or Sin at Ur, she could influence local cults and claim a divine lineage for Sargon's dynasty. Her hymns, often recopied in scribal schools, served as ideological vectors to spread the idea that the king, chosen by the gods, had not only the right, but also the sacred mission to govern. In effect, Enheduanna intimately linked the religious and political spheres, strengthening the cohesion of a multi-ethnic empire through a shared sacred rhetoric. The tablets also reveal that she supervised important rites, sometimes intended to purify or celebrate the city of Ur. Through her influential position, she confirmed the dynastic legitimacy and served as an example for the women of the court. Without her cultural action, the Akkadian Empire would have lacked a unifying spiritual relay. The influence exerted by Enheduanna extended beyond the strictly religious framework. Indeed, the Mesopotamian sanctuaries also served as economic and educational centers. Many scribes were trained there, stocks of goods were stored there, and the priests managed lands from which they collected tribute. By holding a high-ranking position within these institutions, Enheduanna strengthened the dynasty's grip on Sumerian society. Furthermore, by glorifying Inanna, she legitimized a cult whose devotion reached far beyond the borders of Sumer. This goddess of war and love indeed possessed an appeal that resonated with various peoples, facilitating the acceptance of the Akkadian Empire among distinct cultural communities. Enheduanna's hymns have withstood the test of time, being recopied over the centuries, testifying to the longevity of her literary and religious influence. Scholars sometimes see in them one of the earliest examples of the use of writing in the service of centralized imperial propaganda. It is important to emphasize that at this time, closely associating royal power with major urban deities offered a formidable means of consolidating the obedience of the governed. Thus, Enheduanna was not only the daughter of a great conqueror, but she was also, and above all, one of the spiritual pillars of the Akkadian Empire. Through her texts, she wove a lasting link between the throne and the sacred, a link that remained vibrant. Practically speaking, this religious support translated into significant popular backing for the central authority. When ceremonies dedicated to Inanna or Nana took place, gatherings in the sanctuaries provided the court an opportunity to affirm its prestige. The religious processions also showcased imperial banners, emphasizing the communion between temporal power and the deities. Moreover, the fact that Akkadian became one of the liturgical languages contributed to its dissemination, as clerks and scribes now had to master this language to understand and convey the prayers. Cultural unification therefore advanced hand in hand with the translation of sacred texts. The Akkadian rulers could then boast of a quasi-universal divine legitimation within their sphere of influence. It happened that some priests remained faithful to older Sumerian traditions and challenged the hegemony of the royal family, but the support of Enheduanna and the network of temples affiliated with the dynasty managed, on the whole, to curb these resistances. Thanks to this political and spiritual synergy, the Akkadian Empire consolidated itself through rites and celebrations. It is easier to understand why contemporaries saw Akkad not just as a secular capital, but also as a high place of prestigious cults. This symbiosis between religion and power was a striking feature of the great Mesopotamian empires, of which Akkad was one of the pioneers. This model will persist for a long time in the ancient Orient. The analysis of the organization of the Akkadian Empire clearly reveals how Sargon and his successors managed to consolidate a vast territory despite its cultural diversity. The imperial administration relied on various tightly interconnected mechanisms. On the one hand, there were the material infrastructures, the capital, the riverine routes, the relay system for quickly delivering messages and goods. On the other hand, there were institutional mechanisms, such as the appointment of Shakanaku governors, responsible for collecting taxes and maintaining order. Finally, there were religious and cultural practices, embodied by the figure of Enheduanna, which intimately linked royal legitimacy to divine powers. This triple articulation, material, administrative, and spiritual, explains why the Akkadian Empire managed to maintain its cohesion for a number of years, even though it was surrounded by peoples likely to challenge its supremacy. The cuneiform tablets discovered in various Mesopotamian archives also indicate that this centralized administration was coupled with a certain local flexibility. Indeed, ancestral traditions were not systematically eradicated, and some local elites retained a privileged status as long as they recognized Akkad's supreme authority. In this context, standardization did not necessarily mean crude uniformity, but rather a gradual harmonization of practices dictated by the necessity of operating an empire of unprecedented dimensions. Conquered peoples could thus continue to worship their local gods and perpetuate certain rituals, as long as these observances did not threaten the overall balance of the system. Upon Sargon's death, the legendary founder of the Akkadian Empire, the question of power stability and dynastic continuity immediately arose at the imperial court. Sargon had left an indelible mark in Mesopotamian history as an undefeated conqueror, subjugating rival city-states and imposing Akkadian dominance over vast territories. For an international audience unfamiliar with these events, it should be noted that at the end of the 3rd millennium before Christ, Mesopotamia was the vibrant heart of a flourishing civilization. Fortified cities, irrigation canals, and sanctuaries dedicated to Sumerian and Akkadian deities constituted the cultural and political landscape. It was in this context of deeply rooted traditions and local rivalries that the period of succession to the throne began. a delicate moment for any ancient empire. The first to inherit the scepter was Rimush, son of Sargon. Historians estimate that his accession to the throne took place shortly after his father's death, around the mid-23rd century before Christ. It is worth noting that datings often fluctuate in this period due to the lack of unanimous sources. Cuneiform sources indicate that Rimush quickly had to face internal revolts in previously subdued provinces. The Sumerian cities, proud of their ancient lineages and attached to their local cults, did not always show the enthusiasm one might expect for a new sovereign. The Akkadianized vassals, meanwhile, sometimes hoped to take advantage of the change in reign to lighten their tribute or consolidate their autonomy. In a primarily agrarian society, with a cautious economy and fragile cereal production, any disruption could lead to shortages and discontentment. The main challenge for Rimush was thus to restore order, show that he wielded the same iron fist as his father, and prove his legitimacy as king. To quell these revolts, Akkadian texts mention several military campaigns led by Rimush. In some places, the tablets mention imperial garrisons, urgently moved to pacify regions that had risen up. Bronze metallurgy at the time provided more reliable tools and weapons, facilitating the suppression of insurrections. The importance of the bow and the sling, weapons already used by Sargon but perfected under his successors, is also noted. Sumerologists report that Rimush had to notably suppress uprisings in the cities of Uruk, Adab, and possibly even Lagash, which already had a long tradition of political rivalries. The inscriptions found, sometimes damaged, mention quick battles, the re-establishment of loyal governors, and the readjustment of tributes. The empire seemed to hold, but the tension remained palpable. Although he did not enjoy the historical fame of a Naram Sin, whom we will discuss later, Rimush played a pivotal role. He consolidated Sargon's legacy at a critical moment. Administrative archives, sometimes discovered in the ruins of temples, attest to the transport of resources to feed the royal army. They prove that Rimush sought to reinvent the imperial administration by focusing it more on tax collection and the distribution of goods. Officials, designated under various titles, including the Akkadian term Shakanaku for governor, depended directly on the palace and had to account for their actions. In this way, Rimush ensured the loyalty of local elites, who were often attached to their autonomy. However, despite these efforts to rebuild political ties, Rimush's reign was not spared from violence. Sources even mention palace conspiracies. It is suspected that Rimush met his end in one of these troubled circumstances, but details are lacking to accurately reconstruct the end of his reign. After Rimush, his brother Manishtushu inherited the reins of the empire towards the end of the 23rd century before Christ. He was the second son of Sargon to ascend the throne, and his early acts established his taste for trade and maritime expeditions. Indeed, one of the great achievements attributed to Manishtushu was the establishment or consolidation of maritime trade routes to the Oman Peninsula, then called Magan, and the island of Bahrain, then known as Dilmun. For today's audience unfamiliar with these orientations, it should be noted that Magan and Dilmun were famous for their copper deposits, pearls, and their key location on the routes linking Mesopotamia to the Indian subcontinent. Akkadian merchants were especially seeking copper to fuel the bronze industry, essential for making weapons, tools, and ritual objects. Manishtushu, aware of this strategic need, strengthened Akkad's fleet. Certainly, they were not yet talking about large high-seas vessels, such as those known in the classical era, but flat-bottomed boats and craft capable of navigating along the coasts of the Arabian-Persian Gulf. Accounting tablets mention massive exchanges of Mesopotamian cereals for raw materials imported from Magan or Dilmun. This reinforced the prosperity of the imperial center, as Mesopotamia, thanks to its irrigation networks, could generate agricultural surpluses. These surpluses, transformed into export goods, allowed the empire to consolidate its power. Thus, despite the geographical distance, Manishtushu intensified trade ties that had probably been initiated, possibly under Sargon, but which did not become truly productive until his era. However, Manishtushu's reign was not free from troubles. Even if internal revolts seemed momentarily contained, constant tension persisted. The great Sumerian temples, inclined towards political particularism, watched the Akkadian imperial power with some wariness. Moreover, administering a multi-ethnic empire required constant negotiation with local elites. Border areas, particularly to the east, towards Elam, which is in present-day Iran, remained difficult to subdue, and there is a detectable pride in Manishtushu's official inscriptions in reminding that he too fought the dissidents. Unfortunately, the chroniclers of the era do not elaborate with the same precision on how Manishtushu departed the scene. Some accounts suggest that he was assassinated during a plot, stemming from the palace or the army, just like his brother Rimush. This would reveal growing political instability at the top of power, even though the documentation remains fragmentary. Then came Naram Sin, sometimes spelled Naram Sin, undoubtedly the most famous of the Akkadian kings after Sargon. Son of Manishtushu and grandson of the great conqueror, Naram Sin reigned, according to estimates, around 2254 to 2218 before Christ. He marked his era with military and symbolic undertakings of exceptional magnitude. Concerned about the dynastic legacy, he quickly presented himself as the continuer of the imperial work, that is, a leader capable not only of defending the empire, but of expanding its boundaries. Internationally, he is particularly remembered for his extraordinary title of King of the Four Quarters, intended to signify that he ruled over the entirety of the known civilized world. In ancient thought, the universe indeed consisted of 4 cardinal points, and claiming to reign over all 4 signified a universal ambition. The fame of Naram Sin largely stems from the famous victory stele. Initially discovered at Susa in Elam, but probably erected elsewhere and then taken as booty, this monumental stele depicts the Akkadian king marching over defeated enemies, equipped with a horned helmet, an attribute previously reserved for deities. The engravings celebrate the conquest of new regions, particularly against the Lulubi, a mountain people from the Zagros, in what is now northern Iraq and western Iran. The sophisticated iconography illustrates not only victory, but especially the quasi-sacred place that Naram Sin claimed for himself in the cosmic order. He appears larger than the other figures, in a divine posture, thus proclaiming his superhuman status. Such representation affirmed that the king was not only a military leader, but that he directly conversed with the gods, or even embodied a divine aspect himself. This policy of kingly divinization wasn't entirely new. For generations, Sumerian kings claimed divine support, and many throughout Mesopotamian history would claim to be nourished by the gods or chosen by the gods. But Naram Sin took an additional step. He declared himself a living god in the eyes of his subjects, establishing an imperial cult around his person. Tablets indicate that offerings could be made directly to him in sanctuaries dedicated to his glory. Hymns composed to glorify his reign balanced the tale of military victories with the statement of his special relationship with the divine. In the eyes of some modern scholars, this divinization of imperial power constituted a political innovation that later influenced other civilizations, as the idea of a quasi-divine monarch spread throughout the Near East. The reign of Naram Sin, often considered the apex of the Akkadian Empire, also coincided with advanced administrative organization. The reforms initiated by Sargon, then restructured by Rimush and Manishtushu, reached their full expression under Naram Sin. A hierarchy was established, from tax collectors to local governors, always designated Karu, or in Akkadian Shakanaku, and scribes specially trained in cuneiform writing, which became a central tool of the state. Trade routes were secured by regular escorts. Land routes crossed the Taurus and the Zagros, linking the empire to Anatolia, while river routes descended towards the estuaries of the Gulf. Geographical expansion extended in royal inscriptions to the confines of Elam, Syria, and even beyond. Caravans brought back tin, essential for bronze crafting, and the king ensured the regularity of exchanges to maintain military power. However, even at the height of its greatness, the Akkadian Empire began to feel slight tremors, heralding a crisis. Historians sometimes speak of weak signals before the collapse, and Naram Sin himself had to face growing difficulties. Firstly, the military overextension was beginning to weigh heavily on the state coffers. Maintaining garrisons far from the center, meeting the needs of armies positioned on the peripheries, building or repairing fortifications in conquered areas. These were considerable expenditures the empire had to contend with. The more an empire expands, the more the lines of communication and supply lengthen, making logistics costly and difficult. Multiple documents later on would blame the desire of the Akkadian kings to constantly expand their borders, which would have led to the depletion of resources in the very heart of Mesopotamia. Then, a climate event of planetary scale was developing. The drought that began around 2200 before Christ, often referred to as the 4.2 Ka event. Modern researchers, through analyses of sediment cores, fossil pollen, and dendrochronological surveys, the study of tree trunks and their growth rings, have discovered that a wave of drought abruptly affected a large part of the Near East at the end of the 3rd millennium before Christ. In a relatively arid area like Mesopotamia, where crops essentially depend on the flooding of rivers and a carefully maintained network of canals, a drop in water levels could have catastrophic repercussions. The canals risked partially drying out during certain seasons, making agriculture less reliable. Rivers could also become more difficult to navigate. Crop rotation and irrigation, pillars of the prosperity of Sumerian and Akkadian cities, were under threat. At the same time, around these years, 2200 to 2150, before Christ, tensions were felt with several mountainous tribes, notably the Gutians and the Lulubi. To situate these peoples, they inhabited the rugged areas of the Zagros Mountains, to the east of Mesopotamia. For a long time, they had maintained ambiguous relations with the lowland regions. Sometimes they engaged in trade and exchanged mountain products such as wood, stone, and livestock for grains and manufactured goods. Sometimes, in the event of weakness of the central power, they conducted raids to plunder resources. The annals of Naram Sin boast of resounding victories against these populations, but we know from other accounts that they remained unsubdued and posed a permanent threat on the borders of the empire. Historians emphasize that the rise of the Gutians would play a crucial role in the fall of Akkad, but at the time of Naram Sin, these clashes were just beginning to take on worrying proportions. At the same time, the archives of Ebla in northern Syria, near present-day Aleppo, and of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia, near the present-day city of Shatra in Iraq, mention the first grain shortages. For a contemporary audience familiar with modern agricultural crises, it is essential to understand that the Sumerian and Akkadian economy relied almost entirely on barley, the main cultivated cereal, as well as a few legumes and dates from palm groves. Any shortage of this type endangered social balance, as the storage of surpluses was used to feed not only the population, but also the army and major works. When grain rations were lacking, the ability to finance military campaigns was automatically reduced. Moreover, distant provinces, if they received less grain from the center, risked feeling abandoned and could rise again or temporarily break their ties with the crown. The commercial and administrative tablets of the period report a sudden rise in grain prices, sometimes multiplied by 2, 5, or even 10, depending on the region and times. It is a strong indication that production no longer met demand, fueling speculation and discontent. When barley became scarce, famine directly threatened the poorest urban populations, and political stability was weakened. The texts also inform us of the increased need to draw from temple reserves, supposed to constitute a stock of security. Normally, these sacred granaries could save the situation, but the magnitude of the climate crisis seems to have far exceeded ordinary relief capacities, especially as the empire was still conducting costly military operations. This situation foreshadowed, for the decades to come, a period of increasingly difficult to contain unrest. To better understand the dynamics of Naram Sin's reign, it is important to highlight that he ruled over an extremely fragmented world. The cities, each proud of their guardian deities and legendary dynasties, accepted Akkadian authority only when military force or economic interest imposed it. A king like Naram Sin, by elevating himself to divinity, certainly increased his prestige, but risked offending certain local cults jealous of their own pantheon. The erosion of religious consensus around the empire could, over the years, turn against him. Furthermore, governors appointed in the conquered cities had to prove their effectiveness by increasing agricultural yields and regularly sending surpluses to the capital. However, in times of drought and climate disruptions, achieving these objectives became increasingly challenging. Local discontent could then take the form of uprisings, more or less concealed, or simple slowdowns in the sending of tributes. Despite this, it must be acknowledged that, for several years, Naram Sin managed to maintain the illusion of stability. Victorious military campaigns, especially against the Lullaby, maintained the prestige of the God King. Reliefs, steles, and commemorative sculptures displayed in Mesopotamian temples continuously reminded the people of their monarch's power. In return, the royal administration multiplied measures to ensure the functioning of the economy. Weights and measures were further standardized to unify trade within the empire. The fiscal obligations, already structured by Sargon, were reinforced, and new edicts codified the circulation of goods. Although these reforms demonstrated a desire for order, they also created increased pressures on the most modest populations who, lacking grain, could become indebted to the point of losing their lands. Moreover, the king's divinization policy established a costly imperial cult. Statues had to be erected, additional sanctuaries consecrated, and priests dedicated to the cult of the royal person fed daily. This propagandistic investment, while nourishing the sovereign's glory, required additional resources such as gold, silver, and livestock for sacrifices, and workers to build the monuments, etc. In a constantly expanding empire, these expenses would not be a problem if conquest consistently brought in new spoils or if agricultural production increased at the same rate. but signs of economic slowdown accumulated. Internationally, several neighboring kingdoms began to reassess their relations with Akkad, either by taking advantage of a relative weakening to regain their independence, or by negotiating new treaties more favorable to their policies. Towards the end of Naram Sin's reign, these challenges became even more visible. The texts became more laconic, sometimes darker, evoking the apparent anger of the gods against the empire. In the Mesopotamian mentality, a calamity such as a famine, an invasion, or a major drought was often interpreted as a sign of divine disapproval. Naram Sin, having proclaimed his near divinity, was thus expected to ensure the prosperity of his lands. If droughts worsened, if grain prices skyrocketed, and if external tribes invaded the borders, the population could see in these setbacks the proof that the gods had withdrawn their support for the sovereign. According to a later tablet, which might be partly legendary, Naram Sin allegedly broke a sacred taboo by attacking the sacred city of Nippur, thus inciting the wrath of the great god Enlil. Whatever the exact historical fact, it shows that Mesopotamian tradition sought to explain the decadence of Akkad through the excess of pride and violence of its god-king. From a logistical point of view, the multiplication of conflicts at the borders drained resources, forcing the empire to hire even more soldiers and build new fortifications. The army's ration lists, where each soldier received his share of grain, could suddenly become impossible to maintain if the harvests were too poor, especially since the climatic event in question, the so-called 4.2 Ka event, did not manifest as a simple year of drought, but as an episode of multi-decade, even century-long magnitude, affecting rainfall patterns and river flow. On the irrigation canals of Lower Mesopotamia, each decrease in water supply could lower agricultural productivity, which had a cascading effect on all levels of society. Grains, the basis of food, were also essential for religious offerings, the commercial exchange card, and the logistical support of the army. Imbalances could therefore spread very quickly, leading to a spiral of crises from which the empire would not recover. We understand better, therefore, how the peak embodied by Naram Sin could also contain the seeds of downfall. The greatest empires in history have experienced such a discrepancy. At the very moment when power seems at its height, fault lines begin to open, weakening the overall structure. In the Akkadian case, ethno-political tensions between Akkadians and Sumerians, climatic challenges like prolonged drought, external threats from the Gutes and Lullaby, as well as the burden of logistical management, soon combined. Shortly after the death of Naram Sin, his direct successor, Shar-Kali-Shari, had to deal with these difficulties even more brutally. However, the present discussion is limited to painting the picture up to the first signs of crisis. It should be noted simply that the premature disappearance of Naram Sin, or in complicated circumstances, left the empire weakened, and the forces at play soon became more unbalanced. The death of Naram Sin, which occurred at a date still debated but generally placed towards the end of the 23rd century before Christ, marks a decisive turning point in the history of the Akkadian Empire. Son of King Meneshtushu and grandson of the legendary Sargon, Naram Sin had brought the empire to its peak, both through his conquests and by affirming his own divinity. At his disappearance, a formidable void opens at the top of the state. The incessant wars waged at the edges of the territory had already tested internal cohesion. The moment is therefore critical when Shar-Kali-Shari arrives, designated to succeed Naram Sin. His name, sometimes transcribed as Shar-Kali-Shari, and literally meaning the king is all-powerful, raised expectations of a strong continuity of power. In reality, this sovereign is confronted with a series of unexpected challenges, which will disrupt the unity laboriously established by his predecessors. From the early years of Shar-Kali-Shari's reign, several Sumerian cities, once subjected to the capital Akkad, openly expressed their refusal of central authority. Priests and local elites take the opportunity to escape the taxes and tributes imposed by imperial power. Similarly, in Elam, cities subjected by Naram Sin feel the Akkadian grip loosening. Local claimants also rise there, demanding total sovereignty. Revolts multiply, a sign that the imperial machine is no longer able to respond effectively to crises. While Sargon, or Naram Sin, would have quickly crushed these uprisings, Shar-Kali-Shari struggles to mobilize the armies, dispersed throughout the country, to protect trade routes and strategic points. The central administration, often supported by religious propaganda, no longer has the solidity necessary to prevent political fragmentation. The already tense context receives a second blow, this time of a natural order. An extreme climatic episode occurs around 2200 before Christ, now well known as the 4.2K event. Modern analysis techniques like dendrochronology and the examination of sediment cores reveal that a mega drought then strikes the entire Near East. For several decades, rainfall becomes scarce to the point of causing river levels to drop. In the Mesopotamian basin, irrigation water becomes insufficient to meet the needs of the vast barley and wheat fields, carefully maintained until then by a mastered irrigation system. But the lack of water is only the most apparent part of the problem. The concentration of mineral salts increases in the soil, especially around the Euphrates and Tigris, endangering agricultural productivity. Salinization is not a new phenomenon in Mesopotamia, as summer evaporation always leaves salt residues behind. However, when drought sets in, the flow of fresh water needed to regularly leach the soil is lacking. Year after year, salt accumulates on the surface, significantly reducing crop yields. In the cuneiform archives of several Sumerian cities, a notable decrease in barley productivity, the staple grain, is observed. The inscriptions report that the sowing yields only a meager harvest, far below what the military and civil administrators expected. Entire cities, once prosperous, are now facing food insecurity. Clay tablets later retrieved from the ruins of Ebla and Lagash enlighten us on the economic repercussions of this crisis. They mention, in precise administrative language, that the price of a furrow of barley or a defined volume of cereals becomes 10 times higher compared to the rates in effect under Naram Sin. Such a brutal surge is a testament to the extreme stress on reserves. The Imperial warehouse network, supposed to ensure food redistribution in times of famine, can no longer fulfill its role. The surpluses stored when everything was fine are already largely depleted, and the extent of the drought exceeds the forecasts of the scribes tasked with planning the population's needs. In the face of these difficulties, the legitimacy of Shar-Kali-Shari and the confidence in the state apparatus degrade. The development of Sumerian revolts is largely explained by the agricultural crisis, especially since the cities, threatened by famine, no longer accept paying their contributions to a central power they deem incapable of protecting them or stabilizing prices. Furthermore, the dwindling harvests lead to increased internal social tensions, as ruined peasants must sell their land under the pressure of debts contracted to feed themselves. Some are even forced to serve wealthier landowners or temple representatives, forming prolonged dependency relationships that sporadically recall debt bondage. Beyond the strictly local aspect, this climatic shock also exacerbates the difficulties of the Akkadian Empire on major trade routes. For decades, Akkad maintained active trade with various distant regions, exchanging agricultural products, gemstones, metals, and other luxury goods. Now, the decline in yields compromises Mesopotamia's ability to supply food in sufficient quantities. The economy, already weakened by internal uprisings, suffers even more from generalized insecurity, as the roads become less safe, and the political situation deteriorates day by day. In this deleterious climate, the control structures established by the Akkadian administration lose their effectiveness. At the turn of the 23rd century before Christ, the Akkadian Empire faced an increasingly precarious situation. Several factors converged to destabilize this once feared power, and the arrival of the Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains, a vast mountain range located east of Mesopotamia, mostly in present-day Iran, would hasten the collapse of the imperial structure. The ancient sources describe these Gutians as barbarians, without respect for Sumerian or Akkadian traditions. For a contemporary audience, they should be viewed as tribal soldier groups who mastered the art of guerrilla warfare in difficult terrains. They did not form a centralized state in the strictest sense, but rather a set of mobile and aggressive clans. Their ability to strike quickly and retreat into the mountains made any counteroffensive particularly complex. If we look at the geographical situation of the Zagros, one immediately understands why these highlands gave rise to fighters skilled in skirmishes. The slopes and enclosed valleys offer impregnable natural retreats, making stable conquest by a regular army impossible. The Akkadians, despite their military experience, lacked the flexibility to engage in swift battles. Since the time of Sargon, they excelled more in employing disciplined armies capable of striking hard on large battlefields. Confronted with unpredictable raids, Akkadian officers struggled to adapt their tactics. Furthermore, the network of fortresses and garrisons, patiently built during the preceding reigns, proved insufficient against nocturnal incursions and Gutian harassment strategies. The first shock likely occurred towards the end of Shar-Kali-Shari's reign, around 2200 before Christ. This date, often highlighted in clay tablets discovered at Mesopotamian sites, coincides with a major climatic instability period known as the 4.2 Ka event. It involved a mega-drought, the impact of which was felt across much of the Near East. Agricultural yields decreased, soil salinization increased, and starving populations were more inclined to revolt or support invaders. The Gutians took advantage to multiply appearances in the Diyala Valley and along trade routes linking Upper Mesopotamia to Lower Mesopotamia. Gradually, they brought down Akkadian strongholds one by one. The imperial capital, Agade, also known as Akkad, quickly became a prime target. According to preserved inscriptions, the Gutians captured the city after a few irregular but fierce battles. The invaders preferred to harass the suburbs and cut off supply lines rather than besiege directly. This tactic wore down the defenders, who were ill-prepared for prolonged blockades. Fragmentary cuneiform tablets suggest that the capture of Agade was preceded by growing terror. Indeed, the imperial administration, no longer able to ensure the smooth flow of goods, saw its grain stocks decrease at an alarming rate. The scribes, tasked with recording every grain and jar of oil, could no longer keep their records up to date. It was ultimately the surrender of Agade, already weakened by political instability, that marked the point of no return. In the wake, Sumerian cities like Umma and Uruk also fell. Umma, known for its disputes with neighboring Lagash over agricultural boundaries, suddenly found itself in the hands of the Gutians. Uruk, which Mesopotamian tradition venerates as the city of Gilgamesh, could not hold out for long. What was once a land of pride and splendor was plunged into confusion. Temples began to lack offerings, agricultural labor fled, and the influence of sanctuaries waned. The postal network, a system put in place by the Akkadian administration to deliver official tablets, collapsed. Messengers no longer dared to cross zones that had become hostile or deserted. Provinces found themselves isolated, cut off from the decision-making center. The very notion of a center disintegrated as the empire lost all its territorial relay points. The frontier posts no longer communicated with each other, and royal orders no longer reached where they needed to be read. This dismantling favors the emergence of new regional powers. In the absence of central directives, some governors, once mere representatives of Akkad, begin to proclaim themselves kings or independent leaders. This is notably the case in Lagash, where a charismatic figure, Gudea, assumes this royal title. Gudea presents himself as a pious ruler, a temple builder, a protector of religious works. Alongside him, other local rulers imitate this approach. The structures of yesterday are thus replaced by fragmented political entities, sometimes hostile to each other, sometimes united against the Gutian presence. In some cases, we witness the creation of defensive leagues or even common coalitions. This configuration, which can seem chaotic, testifies to the flexibility of a Mesopotamia accustomed to rivalry between city-states. Meanwhile, the Gutian invaders remain a constant threat, as they do not always directly control the conquered territory. They temporarily establish garrisons, conduct swift raids, and retreat as soon as organized resistance emerges. With the empire's collapse, the economic fabric is profoundly disrupted. Since the reigns of Sargon and his successors, the Akkadian Empire had built a long-distance trade network. Caravans transported tin from Iran and Anatolia, while lapis lazuli came from the distant Badakhshan in present-day Afghanistan, and other luxury goods came from the shores of the Arabian-Persian Gulf. This circulation of goods in exchange for cereals, oil, or textiles ensured the prosperity of urban centers. However, the Gutian invasions, by undermining the security of the roads, break this vital flow. Merchants fear banditry, river ports no longer receive their cargo, and urban artisans find themselves deprived of their raw materials. Monuments intended to be erected in honor of Akkadian splendor are left abandoned. The construction sites empty, and stonemasons flee to still-spared cities or enlist their services with local rulers who promise protection and payment. In the warehouses, the scarcity of products leads to an unnatural rise in prices. Tablets that mention the value of grain or oil indicate a rapid inflation. What was worth a shekel of silver can now be worth 10, or even more, in the span of a few years. The population, already strained by declining harvests, finds itself unable to purchase food in sufficient quantity. Trust in official weights and measures erodes because the central authorities, normally tasked with enforcing a unified system, can no longer oversee the use of standardized scales or bars. In many cities, multiple standards are used, leading to disagreements and growing chaos within the markets. The crisis also takes on a religious and social dimension. Several Sumerian sources, including some fragmentary inscriptions called lamentation prayers, describe the sorrow that grips the people in front of temples left abandoned, vandalized, or stripped of their treasures. The looting of sanctuaries destabilizes the sacred balance, as the gods are supposed to physically inhabit these places. The inhabitants feel abandoned, deprived of the divine protection once ensured by a centralized clergy. With economic distress at its peak, many families become indebted to survive and end up selling their children or themselves into slavery. This phenomenon, well documented in archives, is compounded by massive departures to more stable regions such as Upper Mesopotamia or the nascent Assyria. The migratory flows accelerate the disorganization of cities under Gutian control, while new tensions arise with the local populations of the host regions. In this context, there are various military attempts to restore, at least partially, the old order. The imperial power of Akkad tries to rebuild under Dudu, then under Shuturul, two Akkadian sovereigns whose reigns are poorly documented and whose effectiveness in restoring central authority remains weak. Dudu and Shuturul attempt to raise new troops, organize the defense of the few still loyal provinces, and send emissaries to the city-states to unite their forces. However, the lack of logistical means, division among the almost independent cities, and the fear caused by Gutian raids severely hamper these reconquest operations. In parallel, the idea of matrimonial alliances with Elam, a region located to the east of Mesopotamia, centered on the Khuzestan Plain, in present-day southwestern Iran, emerges as a last-ditch diplomatic strategy. By marrying Elamite princesses or marrying off their own daughters to prominent Elamite figures, the Akkadian kings hope to gain the military support of this neighboring power. However, Elam itself is under economic pressure and climate crisis, and can only supply limited reinforcements. The Elamite caravans face difficulties crossing the Zagros passes, which are saturated with Gutian warriors. The marital alliances, theoretically promising, prove to have no real effect. The lack of resources and general disunity leave little hope of restoring the situation. The Gutian occupation period is not always characterized by a structured administration from the invaders. Sources indicate that some Gutian leaders tried to proclaim themselves kings of Sumer and Akkad, but the cohesion of these groups remains fragile. Some Gutian clans prefer simply to plunder and depart. Others stay for a more extended period in strategic cities, take over grain stocks, attempt to collect taxes, or even install their own local governors. The Mesopotamian populations, accustomed to a relatively distant but stable central state, face a series of pressures and exactions varying according to the Gutian leaders in place. This dark episode will last a few decades, leaving deep scars in Sumero-Akkadian collective memory. Later tablets will describe this period as a time of desolation, great confusion, and abandonment by the gods. In later sources, the final fall of Akkad is surrounded by significant symbolic charge. The capital, Agada, after its occupation by the Gutians, finally ends up abandoned. The exact location of this site is still a subject of archaeological debate. Several locations in central Mesopotamia have been proposed, but no definitive discovery confirms the precise location of the ancient imperial city. In the Sumerian imagination, Agada becomes a scorched land where nothing grows, as commonly described in the text of the Curse of Agado. This literary work, written later, tells how a disagreement between King Naram Sin and the great god Enlil would have led to divine wrath, punishing the city of Akkad with destruction and desolation. Although this account primarily reflects theological concepts, it corresponds to how popular memory explains the ruin and oblivion of the city. As the situation worsens with proliferating uprisings and the Gutian dominance, a Sumerian uprising eventually organizes. It is led by Utu-Hegel, king of Uruk, a figure who manages to rally several cities of Lower Mesopotamia in a joint effort to drive out the invaders. Tablets mention a decisive victory against the Gutian king Tirikan, probably around 2110 before Christ. This triumph has considerable resonance as it liberates Uruk from Gutian control and gives hope to other Sumerian cities. Gradually, Gutian authority retracts in the face of this growing resistance. If Utu-Hegel's reign is brief and fails to consolidate a lasting hegemony, it paves the way for a major change in regional geopolitics. It is then that Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, steps in. After Utu-Hegel's death, this ambitious ruler seizes the opportunity to impose his authority over the Sumerian plain. Under his leadership, a new center of power is established at Ur, an already venerable city, located not far from the Persian Gulf, which has receded over the millennia but was then closer to the city than today. Ur-Nammu presents himself as the restorer of order, the guarantor of piety towards the gods, but above all as a builder of a new Sumerian empire. He draws inspiration from the administrative structures developed by the Akkadian Empire, which he recycles and adapts to his own needs. In contrast to the Akkadian period, marked by an intensive use of Akkadian as the official language, there is a strong resurgence of Sumerian and royal inscriptions, although Akkadian remains present in many areas of bureaucracy. Among Ur-Nammu's notable innovations is the promulgation of the Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the oldest known law codes. This text reflects a desire to organize public justice, to set penalties for various offenses, and to preserve social cohesion. Although only fragmentary copies have reached us, one can clearly discern the intention to protect certain categories of the population from abuse, as well as the prominence of measured punitive actions. This code illustrates the continuation of a legislative tradition initiated by accounting and centralized management under Akkad. Taxes, levies, and redistribution play a crucial role again in the stability of the new kingdom. On the military front, Ur-Nammu's rise depends on the creation of an army better adapted to the new post-Guccian conditions of Mesopotamia. The fortifications of major cities are strengthened, and a coherent defensive system is put in place to avoid reliving the tragedies suffered during the invasion. The Sumerian contingents gradually clear rural areas of the presence of the last Gutian strongholds. Some inscriptions suggest that the Gutians try to regain the initiative, but the alliance of the Sumerian cities and coordination under Ur-Nammu's leadership prevent them. The climatic conditions remain challenging, but the drive towards reconstruction takes precedence and ensures Ur-Nammu a certain success. The Akkadian legacy, despite the negative image left by the period of decline, is not erased. The administrative innovations imposed by Sargon and Naram Sin are simply reused in an adapted form. The systematic collection of taxes, the institution of a network of scribes, the use of official seals to guarantee the authenticity of goods and documents, all this is maintained and perfected. Necessary adjustments particularly concern the restoration of trust in weights and measures, in the central authority's ability to protect trade routes, to bring back exotic goods, and, more broadly, to restore the prestige of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. From the perspective of international relations, the fall of Akkad eventually allows a resumption of commercial flows. Trade between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia becomes possible again, although the volumes of goods remain smaller than in the past. Ships laden with precious goods once again traverse the canals and river, linking the Sumerian hinterland to the shores of the Arabian-Persian Gulf. Envoys from Ur can thus attempt to establish or re-establish contacts with the mercantile cities of Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, and Magan, modern-day Oman. These links, already initiated during the time of Manishtushu under the Akkadian Empire, again contribute to the economic prominence of the region. In terms of diplomacy and ideology, the fall of Akkad exerts a notable influence on how foreign rulers will conceive their own titles. The Hittites, a people from central Anatolia, will later adopt titular formulas echoing traditional Akkadian. In Egypt, although the cultural context is very different, the idea of proclaiming oneself king of the lands will sometimes resonate with the universalist ambition of the pharaohs, especially during the New Kingdom, from the 15th to the 11th century before Christ. This influence is certainly not direct, but it testifies to the intellectual and political circulations within the ancient Near East. Certainly, the use of Akkadian as a lingua franca in regional diplomacy continues beyond the fall of Akkad. Indeed, Sumerian remains the liturgical and scholarly language for official inscriptions at Ur. However, Akkadian, a well-proven Semitic language, retains a privileged place for correspondence with the eastern, northern, or western regions. Long after the extinction of the Akkadian Imperial lineage, successive princes and petty kings employed this language to negotiate treaties, draft letters, and conclude transactions in a geographical space that far exceeds the original Sumerian-Akkadian framework. The archives found in Mari, on the Middle Euphrates, also use Akkadian, as do those discovered in Syria and in the Levant region. When discussing the definitive fall of Akkad, one should not imagine a sudden disappearance as a single, abrupt event. It is rather a process stretched over several decades, marked by the Gutian intrusion, internal divisions, and then the slow emergence of new powers, of which Ur-Nammu's would be the most noteworthy. The scorched earth mentioned in the curse text symbolizes the idea of divine punishment, but also the reality of famine, disorder, and profound weakening of the region. The abandonment of the capital Agade illustrates the erasure of a dynasty and a form of political centralization. Nevertheless, the Akkadian experience does not completely fall into oblivion, as administrative reforms, large-scale cuneiform writing practices, and some imperial concepts survive and inform the construction of the new political structure emerging at Ur and later in other Mesopotamian kingdoms. At the end of this historical shift, we see the emergence of an era more focused on the Sumerian dynasties, restored to prominence after enduring Akkadian domination. The tablets from the beginning of the third dynasty of Ur show a desire to distinguish themselves from the previous authority while reusing its most useful advancements. The title of King of Sumer and Akkad remains in use, revealing that the memory of this cultural duality is unbroken. The new power seeks to reassure the population by presenting itself as a spiritual and administrative guide, concerned with regulating justice and maintaining the prosperity of temples. The so-called Neo-Sumerian period sees a proliferation of projects aimed at rebuilding sanctuaries and re-establishing irrigation canals, vital elements to reviving agriculture and the local economy. Similarly, international connections that had languished are revived. Scribes, still based in palaces and temples, ensure correspondence with distant regions, engage in negotiating trade agreements, and exploit the flexibility of Akkadian to cross linguistic borders. Several archaeological sites attest to the return of a certain prosperity, evident in the remnants of pottery, jewelry, and the proliferation of cylinder seals. The cylinder seal, a small stone object engraved with symbolic scenes, is used to seal jars, boxes, and official documents. Its use becomes widespread under Ur-Nammu to guarantee the authenticity of goods and prevent fraud, continuing the practice established under Akkad. The consequences of Akkad's fall, beyond the Mesopotamian sphere, are also measured in the general reorganization of trade routes. To the north and east, the caravan routes linking the region to the Iranian plateaus, Anatolia, or even Transcaucasia do not escape the upheavals caused by political turmoil. In several regions, it is observed that the spread of written Akkadian continues to progress, proving that the local elite still considers this language a prestigious and effective tool. The princes of Elam, geographically close, now maintain fluctuating relations with restored Sumerian Mesopotamia. Moreover, some communities of nomadic shepherds, whose presence is attested on the roads linking the plains to the steppe, reappear or partially settle on the depopulated former Akkadian lands, taking advantage of opportunities offered by perhaps less monitored lands. Gradually, the memory of the Gutian invasion becomes depoliticized, turning into a historical lesson about the risks of excessive centralization without defenses adequately adapted to unpredictable external threats. Later writings sometimes see it as divine punishment for an overly arrogant empire, sometimes as a simple reversal of military fortune. Centuries later, when Mesopotamia experiences other invasions, notably by the Amorites and then the Kassites, collective memory will recall that the region is often coveted and weakened by the complexity of its territorial organization. Neo-Assyrian analysts, for instance, will describe the Gutians as the first avatar of enemies from the mountains, foreshadowing other border conflicts they will have to manage. Despite this later, somewhat negative perspective, the Gutian presence cannot be reduced to an episode of mere chaos. Archaeologists and historians are still trying to determine if there was a form of cultural syncretism or the integration of certain Gutian clans into Mesopotamian society, even at a local level. Some inscriptions mentioning Gutian names in administration or cult raise questions. Could it be that some Gutian leaders sought to legitimize their power by partially adopting written culture, Mesopotamian religion, or even certain institutions such as permanent garrisons? The documentary gaps make these questions difficult to settle, but the overall fragility of central power during these decades did not prevent some cultural exchanges or occasional assimilations. Ultimately, the stronger fusion of peoples, the reorganization of roots, the restoration of temples, the resumption of trade, and the reinvention of centralized administration under the third dynasty of Ur lead to a new prosperous era. Although the Akkadian Empire had vanished, it left behind fundamental innovations in administrative technique, legislative tools, the dissemination of Akkadian writing, and a royal ideology with a universal vocation. This legacy spreads far beyond the borders of ancient Mesopotamia, as the idea of a multi-regional empire with an extensive logistical and diplomatic network paves the way for other imperial experiences in the following centuries. As for the Gutians, their role in Mesopotamian history remains that of a catalyst for major upheavals. Their intrusion is not the sole cause of the collapse of Akkad, already weakened by the complicated succession of Sharkali-Shari, the climate crisis, and resource exhaustion. But they significantly accelerate the dissolution of Akkadian political unity. Thanks to the succession of events that ensues, the land of Sumer is reorganized under Ur-Nammu, and the roots of Sumerian urbanism re-emerge with force. It is in this brutal transition that the transformations allowing Mesopotamia to maintain a central role in the economic and cultural exchanges of the ancient Near East for several more centuries are outlined.